The story of how one spy changed the entire war doesn't begin with a trained agent or a government program. It begins with a man who had nothing to do with intelligence, nothing to do with the military, and nothing to do with strategy. His name was Juan Pujol García, and he should never have become one of the most important figures of the entire conflict. He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a strategist, he was simply a man who despised dictatorships, hated what he saw happening across Europe, and decided that he was going to do something about it, even if nobody else wanted him. He tried to offer his services to the Allies several times and was rejected each time. He had no background, no proof he could help, and no connections. But his determination was unusual. Most people, after being turned away once, move on with their lives. He kept coming back, and when the Allies continued to dismiss him, he made a decision that would change history. If Britain wouldn't hire him as a spy, he would spy anyway. He approached Nazi diplomats in Madrid and pretended to be a fan of their ideology, someone who wanted to help their cause. He made up a story about having access to the British government. He claimed he could gather reports from inside London. And somehow, even though none of that was true, German intelligence believed him. They thought they had discovered a brilliant new asset. They gave him money, code books, and a mission. And with that, this man with no training became a spy, not for the Germans, but ultimately against them. The problem was simple. He had promised the Germans information from Britain, but he wasn't in Britain. He was in Portugal. So he created a solution that no one in the intelligence world had ever attempted. He invented a network of completely fictional agents scattered across the UK. He gave them names, jobs, personalities, family lives, and backgrounds. He wrote detailed reports on their movements. He explained where they traveled, who they spoke to, and how they gathered information. He even wrote about their problems at home, so the stories would feel more believable. And the Germans believed every single detail. They thought this man controlled a large, well-placed network across Britain, even though all of it existed only in his imagination. When he finally moved to London and revealed himself to the British, MI5 realized they had something extraordinary on their hands. Most spies have to hide everything they do. He had done the opposite. He created so much information that the Germans trusted him more than any other agent they had. British intelligence immediately saw the potential. They hired him, gave him the codename Garbo, and began using his invented network as part of a larger deception plan. But for a long time, the Germans had no idea he had switched sides. He continued to send long, carefully crafted messages explaining what his imaginary agents had discovered. He would tell them about military units that didn't exist, supply problems that weren't real, and events that never happened. And because his reports always matched the small, harmless details that British intelligence allowed to leak, the Germans developed complete confidence in him. In a world where spies were constantly under suspicion, he was considered the one man they could absolutely rely on. This growing trust reached its peak in the months before the Allied landings in France. By that point, the Germans were trying to predict where the invasion would happen. They expected it would be somewhere in northern France, but they weren't sure where or when. This uncertainty could have been deadly for the Allies. If the Germans had guessed correctly, the landing could have turned into a disaster. The Allies needed them to believe the invasion would hit a completely different part of the French coastline. This is where one spy changed the entire course of history. The Allies created a massive deception plan. They built inflatable tanks, fake aircraft, and dummy camps to make it look like a huge army was preparing to strike at the port of Calais. They even put General Patton, one of the most famous commanders, in charge of this fictional army to make it seem real. But fake tanks and dummy bases would only work if the Germans received reports confirming what they were seeing from the air. That confirmation would need to come from someone they trusted completely. And there was only one spy the Germans trusted more than all the others combined, the man they knew as Garbo. He told them that his agents had discovered the build-up of a massive force in the southeast of England. He told them that this force was preparing for a direct assault on Calais. He explained its structure, its numbers, and its supply lines. Every detail matched the Allies' deception plan perfectly. German intelligence sent his reports straight to the highest levels. They believed they had proof of the coming attack. And because they trusted him so deeply, they reshaped their entire defense strategy around his reports. On the morning of the actual Allied landing at Normandy, he sent a message explaining that his agents had detected movement, but emphasized that this was only the first wave and that the real landing would still come at Calais. The Germans believed him yet again. While thousands of Allied soldiers fought their way onto the beaches of Normandy, German commanders held back their strongest armored divisions because Garbo said the main assault was still coming. Hours passed, and still they waited. By the time they realized that Normandy was the real invasion site, the Allies had already formed a stable foothold. This delay, this single hesitation, changed the entire war. It allowed the Allies to bring in more troops, more supplies, and more vehicles. It allowed them to secure the beaches and push inland. Without that delay, the landings could have been pushed back into the sea. But because one spy sent a message the Germans trusted, the entire German defense strategy collapsed at the most critical moment. What makes this even more incredible is that Garbo's network wasn't real. The Germans held back their forces based on reports from people who didn't exist. These imaginary agents were treated as some of the most valuable assets in the entire German intelligence system. They were paid salaries. They were given awards. Some of them even received promotions. One of them died during the war, and the Germans sent flowers to honor him. This was the level of trust Garbo had created. Over time, the Germans became so impressed that they recommended him for one of their highest military honors, and he received it. He became one of the only people in the whole conflict to receive a medal from both sides, one from the Germans and one from the Allies. Each side believed he had served them well. Only one side knew the truth. After the conflict ended, he didn't want fame. He didn't want recognition. He had seen enough destruction and enough loss. He worried that former German officials might come after him. He worried that being known as the man who misled their entire intelligence operation might put him in danger, so the British helped him disappear. They helped him build a new life under a new identity. As far as the world knew, he passed away in Africa in the early 1940s. But this, like much of his work, was another carefully crafted illusion. In reality, he moved to Venezuela and lived a quiet life surrounded by people who had no idea they were living next to one of the most influential figures in modern history. He ran a bookshop. He raised a family. No one suspected that the man who sold them school supplies had once shaped the most important military operation of the century. It wasn't until decades later that researchers uncovered what had really happened. They discovered that the reports that reshaped Germany's entire defense plan came from a man with no training. They discovered that the network that fooled the German High Command had never existed. And they discovered that the single most effective agent in the entire conflict wasn't a trained spy, but a man who simply refused to give up. When he was eventually found and interviewed, he said that he never thought of himself as a hero. He believed he had simply done what needed to be done, but the evidence says otherwise. Without his reports, the invasion of France could have failed. Without his deception, the German army might have been in the right place at the right time, and without his imagination, countless lives might have been lost. His story proves something unusual about this period. Massive armies can change a war. Huge fleets can change a war. New aircraft, advanced vehicles, and powerful weapons can change a war. But sometimes a single voice, a single message, or a single act of deception can be more powerful than all of them. One person, acting alone, changed the direction of the conflict simply because he refused to let the truth stop him. The most surprising part of the story is how fragile everything was. The German High Command wasn't stupid. Their intelligence network wasn't incompetent. They were overwhelmed with conflicting reports, and in that chaos, they clung to the one person they believed they could trust. Trust, in this case, became their downfall. Trust in a man who had created an entire world out of nothing, and trust in a network that never existed outside the pages of his imagination. When the conflict ended and historians began putting the pieces together, many were shocked that such a delicate structure had worked. How could the most powerful military in Europe be deceived by invented characters and handwritten letters? The answer lies in the nature of conflict itself. When pressure builds and leaders become desperate for certainty, they look for sources they can rely on. Garbo understood this better than anyone. He fed them what they wanted to hear, shaped it with just enough detail to feel real, and created a world the Germans depended on. Even now, his story stands as one of the most unusual examples of influence. People talk about turning points and great decisions, about commanders who changed strategy and leaders who shifted policy. Yet one of the most important moments didn't come from any of them. It came from a man the world ignored, dismissed, and underestimated. A man who wanted to help but had no path to do so. A man who created his own opportunity and then used it to reshape the largest operation of the entire conflict. His life after the war remained quiet and hidden. He watched the world move on. He watched nations rebuild. He watched as people debated the reasons behind strategic decisions made during those years. He knew the truth, but he rarely spoke about it. He had done what he set out to do. He had stopped the spread of a regime he despised, and he had done it without firing a single shot. Historians still study his reports. Intelligence schools still teach his methods. And even now, more than 70 years later, his deception is considered one of the greatest achievements in the history of espionage. Not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. He understood how people think, how fear shapes decisions, and how uncertainty can be used as a tool. He understood that the right message at the right moment can be more powerful than any weapon. This is how a single spy changed the entire war. Not by force, not by strength, but by imagination, persistence, and a remarkable ability to make others believe in a world that only existed inside his mind.